So if we look at that's great. So we know we're being recorded, that's great. So on the first slide, if we can move to that one, if that's all right. Oh, brilliant. The first thing I really want to kind of say is that we are all sensory beings, and being human means that we connect with other people and we also connect with our world. And the important thing about senses is that that is how we interact with the world, that is how we perceived the world, is through our senses. So everything that we do happens in the very first instance through our sensory system. So we can, if we just go back a little bit, I just wanted to very, very quickly run through. So you'll see I've put down, we're going to talk about 7 senses. So we know that in biology, we probably kind of learned about 5 senses: our vision, our smell, our taste buds, our kind of hearing or listening, and a tactile. But we're also going to look at 2 less kind of more hidden senses, which is our movement sense and our sense of balance. And that's what I'm hoping to give you an overview of. And if we look at the next slide, you'll see that I've said that it's a forest thing. And for me, that's the best way to really describe it, because when we look at our sensory systems, each one of us will have a sensory preference. There will be things that we find annoying. There will be things that we seek out, that we love, absolutely love. But the thing is, when we're in a family or when we're in a workplace, everybody's sensory preferences may be a little bit different. And that's why it's a bit of a forest thing. There's different trees, different heights. They all have slightly different needs. And that's what makes sensory processing a fascinating thing, not only for our children, but for us as a family. And that's the one thing I really want to emphasize, is that it's really important that we recognize our own sensory preferences, the things that annoy us, and the things that we seek out. And then we can put that into context with our family, you know, with our partners and with our children, and also at work, because the thing that it really impacts on, it impacts on our ability to connect with other people, as well as how good we are with attending and processing. So you'll see I've just kind of put that on the side, as sensory integration, as a kind of a little definition, is the way that we register, process, and then respond to sensory information that come into our bodies and our brains. And the way that it does, and the way that our brain responds, will influence how well we adapt to our environment and any task demands that are placed upon us. And that's the same for our children. So let's look at the next slide, and then we're going to really have a little bit more in detail. I've just mentioned the 7 senses, but you will see on this slide the tactile, body position, and balance sense are a little bit bigger. And that is what sets it apart from sensory processing versus sensory integration. So what we find is that our sight and our auditory system, our sound system, those are very much our external systems. They are one of our big warning systems. So when we're in a classroom situation, when we're in a work situation, a lot of what we process is based on the sights and sounds that we experience. Our taste can have a very profound impact on, well, not only on enjoyment, but also on nutrition. And then our smell is very much connected to memories we find, pleasant ones and unpleasant ones. And then our tactile sense, I've just noticed this in there twice. I need to change this, I do apologize, but it is a very important sense. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the tactile sense and the body position sense and the balance sense. But that's just to give you an overview of when we say sensory integration, that this is what we're talking about. So if we move on to the next slide, Let's just stand still with our sense of touch. Now, our sense of touch, we generally have, if we had to kind of simplify it, we have two types of touch. We have a protective touch, light or unexpected touch, which will alert us to danger. And then we have what we call discriminative touch. It tells us what we're touching, how it feels, whether it's soft and fluffy or kind of metal or hard, whether it's big or small. All of those things is what our discriminatory touch system tells us about. And then linked with the touch system is pain. So these two are very, very close together. And interesting about our tactile system, I'm not going to go into neurology, so I'll try my best to kind of not go there, but our touch, I'm not sure whether you might have done this in biology. They always talk about our tactile sense as the biggest sense. So if we had to kind of take the surface of senses, our touch sense makes up most of it because it's all down to our skin. And the receptors can tell us about kind of deep touch, light touch, lots of different ways of touch. But when the messages come in from our body, so externally is when we touch something, the messages that go up to our brain and then go back down to our hands to tell us what we need to do, that discrimination happens in the brain. However, because it's a protective system as well, is when we are touching something and it's really hot, so temperature also comes into the tactile system, the brain doesn't process any of that. So the message will come into our kind of nervous system, to our back, and the message will fly straight back and say, lift your hand, that's dangerous, you're going to burn. So there's two things that happens with our touch system. I'm going to come back to all of this in a minute, but I just want to give you a little bit of a kind of overview of our tactile system. And then if we move to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about the proprioception sense. And this is the body sense that you would have seen in that other slide. Now, the proprioceptive sense is almost as big surface-wise as our tactile sense. It's located, it has little receptors called Golgi tendons, and they are situated inside all of our muscles. So if you think about your muscles, the kind of little spindles of muscles that we get, the proprioceptive receptors are in there, so they can tell us about whether our muscles are contracted or whether they're relaxed. And they also inside all of our joints. So it can tell us about joint position. It can also tell us about pressure. So how much pressure we're using. If we just go back a little bit. So one way that it's one of the ways that I assess proprioception as well, is I'll ask someone to stand on one leg with the eyes open. And then I will ask them to do the same thing with the eyes closed. And the reason is that when we close our eyes, we only have our proprioceptive system to tell us where our body is in space. So it tells us about where we are. It grounds us a little bit, but it also is very important in telling us what is our relation to our environment and to other people around us. And what we sometimes find, I don't know whether you've had that experience, it happens all the time to me, is I'll go to pick up a bag and I'll, in my visual sense, tell me, oh, this is going to be really, really heavy, so you've got to put some muscle into it. And then I'll go with all my muscles will be kind of contracted because that bag is heavy. And then when I pick it up, it kind of goes flying, because I've added too much pressure and kind of too much effort into picking up that bag. So my proprioceptive sense was a little bit delayed there in kicking in. And our proprioceptive sense, I'm going to come back to it again, but it's one of our regulatory senses. So when we're feeling out of sync, and the world is just not quite how we want it to be. When we engage our proprioceptors, we find that we can regulate our body. It will either help us to be more alert, or other times it can help us to feel more calm. And that's why it's a very, very powerful sense. And it really, really impacts on everything that we do. And we find that a lot of children and a lot of people, their sense of proprioception, or their sense of where their body is in space, is often reduced. So that the firing of the little receptors are a bit slow. So we have to activate the proprioceptive system. So on the next slide, I'm just going to very briefly talk about our vestibular system. So our vestibular system is our balance system. It's located in our ears, and it really responds to body position. So in our ears, we've got two systems. We've got our auditory system, which helps us to hear and listen. And then we have these little canals, and they all kind of almost perpendicular to each other. They're all in different little angles, and they're filled with fluid. And inside the fluid, these little hair cells. And when our body moves, when our head moves, the fluid moves with it, and it will then kind of stimulate these little hair cells. And that tells us whether we are upright, whether we are lying down, whether we are a little bit off balance, or whether we are doing somersaults. It will also tell us about speed, whether we're going forwards, whether we're going backwards, whether we are twirling, because these fluids will move with our head position. And the vestibular system is a very, very important sense, as all the others, but it's especially important because, like the ears, and like when we listen, it's on both sides of our body. So it's very, very much telling us where we are, what we're doing, and where we are in relation to the earth. So I don't know if you've, ear infections, sometimes we feel a bit off balance. And the impact that the vestibular system have on our eyes is a lot. When we are, we can use our eyes to fix to the horizon, which helps our balance, but equally so with our vestibular system. If it's not working very well, we can feel very, very unsure. And we find that there's a big correlation between vestibular problems, anxiety, and also a kind of sensitivities around just coping. And sometimes you can get some kids, I'm going to refer to kids, but it's not just kids, it's adults as well. When our vestibular system is not quite working well, or there's disturbance, we find that anger it also kind of is displayed much easier, because you just feel out of whack is probably the best way to explain it. So these are the three kind of big systems that we look at as occupational therapists when we assess kids and adults. It's our tactile sense, our proprioceptive sense. It tells us about where we are in our body, but also in relation to the environment, and then our vestibular sense, or our sense of movement. So these three are really, really important ones. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm just going to just kind of put this out there. All of this will be in your handouts, and you've probably come across this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is a classification system of how we classify sensory processing difficulties. Now, I know it's a sensory processing disorder at the top. I'll just very quickly say that sensory processing difficulties, it's not yet a disorder. So I apologize for that. In the States, they do refer to it as a disorder, but we use the DSM-5 and the ICF classifications. And sensory integration, we've tried very hard, but then it's not yet classified as a disorder. So we refer to it as sensory processing difficulties or sensory integration difficulties. So just very quickly, what Miller has done is she's done amazing work, and she has established that there's 3 big umbrella areas of sensory difficulties. The one is sensory modulation disorder, and that's the bit that I'm going to focus on really tonight, because what we find is if we are not regulated, then nothing else really comes together. So we have to be regulated first before we can properly discriminate, and before we can probably look at even from a motor disordered pattern to make a difference. So sensory modulation disorders, there's 3 big ones: sensory over-responsibility, sensitivity, sensory under-responsivity, and then sensory craving. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time on those tonight. And then in the middle, we've got sensory-based motor disorders, so dyspraxia, developmental coordination disorder, and also a postural disorder comes under that. So the difference really is that dyspraxia, or DCD, is very much about how we plan movement. It's about coordination. It's about, can we organize our bodies to do something that's more unfamiliar? Can we work out how to do it? Whereas a postural disorder means that we haven't got enough sensory information coming into our bodies to help our bodies to stay upright and to cope with all the postural demands that we need to have going through the day. And then finally, sensory discrimination disorder, that can be only in one sense. So you can have visual discrimination difficulties, you can have auditory difficulties, you can have all of it. And you'll see right at the bottom, what I'm hoping to do, let me just say that, what I'm hoping to do is that over the next few training sessions and talks, we'll dive into a little bit more into the discrimination side of things as well, because you'll see the last one, there's interoception. And interoception is our sense of our internal working, so our internal organs, and that has a significant impact on eating, on sleep, but also on toileting. So we'll really deep dive into the discrimination side of sensory difficulties in some of the future talks. So that's sensory processing just as an umbrella. So if people talk about it, I hope this is helpful just to kind of just put it into a little classification. So for me, when we look at sensory modulation, if we go to the next slide, for me, it's very much a volcano and teacups effect. So what we find with teacups, the reason why I often link it with teacups is that the size of your cup really matters. And we can have different cup sizes for different senses. In other words, your visual sense can have a big cup, and your sense of taste has a smaller cup. And when we're trying to explain sensory modulation, as I said, we have 3 aspects to it. We either sensory sensitive, we're sensory avoidant, or we have a low registration. So what does that mean in terms of a teacup? So if you imagine you've got a teacup and it's filled with water, so with what we want to look at is what happens when that cup starts to fill. So for sensory, when we've got low sensory registration, in other words, there's a kind of sensory under responsivity. So that means we need a lot of water to fill that cup. In other words, we need a lot of sensory input before our bodies start to recognize the sensory information. So that means that some kids will miss information, they may seek out more intensive sensory input because their bodies can't make sense of what is happening around them. So sometimes you will find kids that fiddle or that are kind of touching everything. It could be one of two things. It could be that they're sensory seeking, but it could also be that those cups are just very, very empty, and they're looking for more and more sensory inputs so that they can get to a point where they can register sensory information. So that's when we've got a big cup and we need to fill it up. We can often have kind of a low sensory registration or sensory under responsivity. But then our cups naturally can be quite full. And what can happen is when we fill it, there's not much space. And if we fill it slowly, that could be okay. And it can just maybe gently overflow, which means that we can be quite sensitive to sensory information. So it doesn't take much for us to feel slightly overwhelmed. But it can also be, if you've got a full cup and you drop a big lump of ice in it, it just splatters over. And that could be where we have that shock response. So something unexpected happens and we have this kind of meltdown effect or real fright effect. So that's when we've got an over responsivity to tactile information. So that's when we are often avoiding sensory information, or we are very, very sensitive. So we find it really difficult to filter out sensory information, or we are so kind of afraid that our cup someone is going to unexpectedly drop a big blob of ice in there, that we avoid it altogether, and we'll just say, no, thank you, I don't like it. So as I'm talking, I'm hoping that you can maybe think about your own child or yourself, and think about, when is it that you sometimes miss sensory cues in terms of sensory registration, or when is it that you have an over responsivity to different sensory information. And then finally, we can also have a cup that is leaking. So there's a hole at the bottom of the cup. So it doesn't matter how much sensory input you pour in, it will leak out. So that is when we see sensory seekers. So it's kids who will continue and look and look and look, but they never meet that threshold. Their bodies never go, whoa. Their bodies never go, oh, that's enough. They will seek and seek and seek and are often on the go, and they really find it hard to settle down to one thing. They often find it really difficult to go to sleep because everything is just whizzing and they're looking for more sensory input. But their cup really hardly ever gets filled to a point where they are satisfied, and where that threshold, we talk about a threshold, is reached. So that's the teacups. Just something very small about, very quickly, about volcanoes, the volcano effect. I'm sure a lot of you will recognize that in yourselves, but also maybe in your children or people that you know. It's that cumulative effect. So throughout the day, you may have got a lot of things anyway happening, and it may be quite a stressful time, and so your cup is fairly full. But throughout the day, little bits get added, and then by the end of the day, you're done, or your child is completely done after a hard day of school, having to kind of sit through 5-6 lessons, break time, lunch time, and it's sensory kind of demands coming from everywhere. So a lot of us will try and keep it together when we're in a place where, social acceptable behavior is expected, like in a school environment. But when we get home to our safe space, that's when we just cannot take anymore, and that's when meltdowns often happen. So it's that cumulative effect across the day. And that's why, as occupational therapists, we will often say, when we're looking at sensory regulation, when we are trying to kind of not only look at the time that the child attends school, but we're trying to think about what happens from the time that they wake up all the way through to bedtime. Because it's really important for parents and for teachers that we have the whole day covered, so that there's just enough and just the right level of sensory information going across the day. For some kids, we need to up it and down it, but that's really, really important to avoid that meltdown at the end of the day. So that's just something about volcanoes and teacups, and I hope that that's a helpful explanation. So on the next slides, I'm not going to spend too much time because you can read it all and there will be more information, but just again reiterating the three big kind of sensory profiles that we have especially when kids are out of whack, when they're dysregulated is what we will call it. So sensory avoidant are those kids that really find sensory inputs overwhelming. It can be kind of very, very small amounts of sensory information that most other people can tolerate, maybe the same for you. And what they will do is they will actively avoid it. And they avoid it in different ways. Sometimes they will just kind of not participate. So they will be quietly at the back of the class, not just keeping quiet and not taking part because that's not their thing. Sometimes when that demand keeps on coming in and there's an expectation for them to participate, that's when we will often see our kind of our fight-flight system being activated. So that's when we can have kids who will verbally say or will kind of physically make it known that this is a no-go. We're not going there. And that's actively avoiding whatever that sensory overwhelming demand is being made to them. And that's the distressing things. And I think that's when we see kind of stress and anxiety and trauma often happen, is when there's a persistent demand for children, an expectation for children to join in sensory demands, which is everything that we do, but that they are not that there isn't a recognition that this is really in a level that's painful for them, or that's at the level that they cannot cope with. So that's sensory avoidant. If we look at the next slide, it's sensory seeking. So this is our leaky cup kids who will just be on the go all the time, and they will be looking for extra sensory input all the time. They are the fidgeters. They are the ones that kind of bop on their chair. They are the ones who will climb wherever they want to climb. They kind of the danger ones who will kind of just will crash or jump and sometimes don't have a sense of this is unsafe. So that we have very hard to kind of keep attending. It's sometimes really hard for them to stick with one thing. They would kind of be the ones who flit across the room from one thing to another. And there is a correlation with ADHD, but they're also separate. And it's difficult to separate it. And the only way we really know at the moment to do it without kind of putting kids through MRIs is that we know that there's the Conners questionnaires that kind of look at ADHD, and then we look at sensory as well alongside that. And then often we will think about a medication trial, and what we'll say is that if the medication is effective, we know that it is more of an ADHD than sensory seeking. Sometimes the two are combined. So just to explain that a little bit, ADHD is something that happens where two cells meet, there's the synapse, so the jumping of information goes wrong. Is probably the best way that I'm going to explain it. And don't ask me more technical information because I don't have it. But that's how I understand it. It's at that cellular level where the synapses happen, and it can be all sorts of things. It can be the juice that kind of get the message from one cell to another that's kind of not working well. It could be the actual message, sending it across, that doesn't work very well. There's lots of reasons, but that's where ADHD happens. And that's why medication is often effective, is because the medication will go to that cellular level and it will address it. What we find with sensory seeking is something that happens in the brain. So it happens at different levels. So we've got you kind of three big areas of the brain when we talk about sensory processing. In the first instance, it's the brainstem, the right kind of bottom bit of the brain, which controls our breathing, our temperature, our heart. That's our survival bit. So the messages come in there, and if the brain doesn't quite recognize it, it will seek more. But as I said, for some kids, the messages will come into the brain and it will be scattered. And the brain will go, whoa, I'm just going to look for more. I'm going to go. And so just, sensory seeking in its pure form happens in the brain. ADHD happens at a cellular level. But a lot of times these things overlap and it's all over the place, and it can be very, very challenging. So if we look at the next slide, that's under responsive, and that's what I was talking about. The information comes in from outside or from inside our bodies, and it gets to the brain, and the brain goes, what? I'm not sure. I didn't quite get that. So the brain will do one of two things. It will either say, I need more information, and then you'll see often kids will be looking like seekers because they'll be looking for more intensive information to try and make sense of what is it that they're experiencing, or they will just miss it and they will just miss cues. So often we can see that on a social level where kids just get it wrong because they've missed the nuances of facial expressions in someone else. They've missed auditory information. They didn't hear and they couldn't process the sounds. Sometimes under responsive, they can put themselves into quite vulnerable situations because they just didn't spot danger. They just didn't spot this is a tricky situation, or this is a situation where I may get bullied. They just don't spot it because they are under responsive. So the cues that come in is being processed too slowly, or there's not enough. So often we will also see that the kids can be quite tired, or just unaware of their surroundings. And again, there's an overlap with ADD, so the bit of attention deficit disorder without the hyperactivity, where they're not aware of their surroundings. And as I said, and again, it's the same thing. It's sometimes tricky to work out, is it this? Is it just sensory? Or is there an ADD aspect to it as well? So I'm talking a lot. I don't know whether I need to take a breather and just check in with people. If there's any questions, I don't know, Emma, what do you think? Shall we just do a quick 2-minute stop and just check in with people? Is everybody, if you want to just put in the chat box, are you okay? And then I'll just kind of go with whatever you say.
I think if we push through to the sort of the 8 o'clock, and then we can sort of do all the questions in one go, run through them. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Thank
you. Good.
Everything you're saying is wonderful. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome to kind of not agree, and I'm very open. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense, and I appreciate it's a lot of talking and a lot of information, but do go back and have a slower read of any of this if you feel you kind of just need to kind of understand that a little bit more. But these three things are the sensory modulation difficulties that we have. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the links between sensory integration and our emotions. So we can move on to the next system, because the one thing that I think is very, very important to remember is that as a human being, we are a person. We're not a visual system. We're not a tactile system. We're not an emotional system. It's all connected. Everything about us is connected. Our gut is connected to our well-being. Our emotions are connected in different ways, and they all respond and inter-respond with each other. So when we have particularly sensory processing difficulties, we know that there's a very, very strong link with our limbic system. So I'll just talk about that a little bit. So in our brain, right in the center, it's the most middle bit of our brain. So it's really protected. Right in the middle, there's a little bit that's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is our emotional control system. So what happens with all of this sensory information that's coming into our body or into our brain? It goes through the brainstem, and then it almost immediately pops into what we call the limbic system. So the limbic system is the amygdala is part of that system that tells us about whether this is dangerous and what our response needs to be. So you'll see there's a little example there, a bus is coming towards me, and so our visual system detected that, our auditory system detected that. The information goes into our brainstem, it goes straight to our amygdala, and our amygdala interprets it as, you need to step out of the way, this bus is not going to stop. This is life-threatening. So you've got to have a fear response. You've got to kind of jump back. And that's our and that's a very, very important function. It keeps us safe. But the other thing that happens is when we are stressed, and especially when we have long-term stress, our amygdala and our limbic system kind of form memories. So, and this is where I was talking about kind of smells is directly. So when I talk about smells, is our smell sense is the only one that doesn't, it goes straight into the limbic system. It doesn't bypass anything else. So when we smell something, it goes straight to the limbic system, because when our kind of cavemen forefathers, they very much relied on their smell system to tell them whether this is going to be life-threatening, what they're going to eat or not. So by smelling, they could detect whether this is a rotten apple or whether it's a juicy apple. And they knew it was safe then to eat, because they can't taste it, because by the time they tasted it, that could be it for them. So our smell system is a very, very protective system. But on a positive note, our smells also gather beautiful emotions. So I don't know, if you think back to a happy memory from a long time ago. So it could be something in someone's cooking, or for me, it's often when I smell oranges, and especially when you break them open and that orange smell comes in, that takes me right back to my aunt, and they lived on a little small holding, and our best thing as kids was that was the big treat, because I was a little townie. So for me to go to their plot of land was just amazing. And it was that sense of we were climbing into the orange trees and we would kind of grab the oranges from the trees and we could break them open. And that happy memory is still with me. So whenever I open, whenever I kind of peel an orange, I go straight back and I think, oh, even if it's just momentarily, I think back, and it brings a smile to my face. So our limbic system is very, very important for memories, for experiencing pleasure, but also to tell us when something is life-threatening. And it's critical for times of stress. And that's what we find with our children. When their limbic system is constantly bombarded by sensory information that is unpleasant, they will form a memory attached to that. And that is often how, when we look at kind of trauma or school trauma especially, or when our kids don't want to go to school anymore, it's because the memory of what is school, that can have a significant impact on who they on their experiences. And it is something that we address as occupational therapists. We try and kind of change that memory when it's, well, you've got to be very careful because we've got to make sure that that environment is safe. But it is something that we can address through sensory integration, is to kind of not reshape the memories, but you create new memories. And that's one of the messages that I also want to bring, hopeful messages, is when we are playing, when our kids are playing, when our kids are having fun, those fun moments is what builds the limbic system, and that is what is a very protective factor for our limbic system. So one of my messages tonight is really think about playfulness in your home, and creating playful memories. And now I know it's easier said than done. I've got 2 kids myself, and I can promise you it's not always playful in my house. But it's trying to kind of just have that in the back of your mind for yourself sometimes. I think in a stressful relationship, when we're with our partner, even then, I don't know, I'm sure you've experienced that sometimes emotions can be really heightened, and then sometimes something happens and it's just funny, and that's an instant tension reliever. But also, what it also does is it's kind of, our limbic system is there's a memory sent to our limbic system, and it will hold on to it. So what we find with kind of trauma, developmental trauma, adverse experiences, is the more we can create fun moments, is what I call it, the more we can create that, the more protective we can be, and the more we can kind of convince the limbic system that it is now safe. This is now safe. Limbic system, you can start to relax. And this is how we start to kind of build up those and break down those trauma experiences from a sensory perspective. Is we're really trying to bolster the limbic system and kind of fill it with fun moments. But of course, now I'm saying that, we have to make sure that the environment is safe. There's no point in trying to kind of fool the limbic system by having lots of fun moments, but the environment is unsafe. So whether that's a school environment or other environment, if we want to convince the limbic system things are safe, it has to be safe. And then we use fun moments and fun interactions to build it. So that's the limbic system in a long-winded way. But I'm hoping that we can spend maybe one evening just talking about emotions and sensory integration. We can perhaps go, if that's something that's of interest, I'm very much open to people suggesting what would they want to hear more of. So this slide here is one of my favorite slides, because it really it really kind of shows us what happens in terms of sensory modulation and regulation. Sensory modulation is not static. You know, if we think about, I'll use myself as an example. I'm more of a night owl than I am kind of an early bird. So, you know, in the mornings, my arousal levels are very low, and I need strong coffee, and I need a very gentle start to the day. Otherwise, my body will just kind of just rebel and say, I'm not having this. So in terms of my arousal level, I need coffee. So I'm seeking extra sensory input to kind of wake my system up. And then I will have, I'm not a big breakfast eater, but I will usually have a yogurt or something fairly smallish, just to kind of get me on the road. And then by about 11 o'clock, I'll kind of feel ready to have a more proper breakfasty kind of meal. But what happens if we look at our kind of regulation throughout the day? So I will start off really low, and then I will go into my optimal stimulation. I can kind of stay within that. I will fluctuate within the optimal band of tolerance. So from a sensory perspective, you know, I'm usually awake by the time that I start to see a kid. I'm usually awake when I start to drive. And I will listen to music. I tend not to listen to music is something that I use very regulatory for myself. So in the mornings, I have to admit it's usually quite poppy and quite waking up type of music. Whereas by the afternoon, my cup is usually full by the afternoon, and I just need quiet and calm. And I will often then listen to classical music on my way home. And then throughout the day, my sensory threshold. So if we talk about sensory thresholds is my cups. So if I think about my cups will be filled up and, you know, kind of in different levels throughout the day. And I will fill it with sensory input, and then I will use some of that, and my cup will become a little bit more empty. So I'll need a little bit more to attend. But generally speaking, I'm usually in the optimal band, so threshold. But what I want to kind of use this slide for is just to explain that for some of us, our optimal stimulation band, as it's called, or that threshold, can be quite big. So our tolerance levels for sensory demands coming in can be quite big. We can cope with quite a lot, and we can cope with a lot of fluctuation. For some of us, or for some of our kids, our threshold and our stimulation band can be very small. In other words, the fluctuations that happens naturally throughout the day can have a real impact. You know, so we can be overwhelmed very quickly because our band is much narrower. So we will go out of the band very quickly. We will either have these big fluctuations where we are kind of over responsive and can have a meltdown, or we are under responsive and we are literally falling asleep. And for some kids, that is it. They just cannot stay in that middle band. They're either over or they're under. The middle just is too tricky. They just cannot stay there. And that is when we start to see that sensory, they become dysregulated. And that's one of the things that we try and do as occupational therapists, is we're trying to kind of really work on that middle band, is trying to kind of either expand it a little bit so that children have more tolerance for the sensory demands from what they get from the environment, or we help them to have less big variations so that the variations become smaller and they can stay in that optimal band a little bit more. I will talk a little bit, again, not tonight, about some of these programs that you may have come across. There's the alert program, there's zones of regulation, and that's primarily what they aim is. They're trying to use a cognitive approach, so a thinking approach, to to address this and teaching kids how to stay in that optimal stimulation band as much as possible. But that's something that we can address a little bit more. So we will, all of this, I'm happy to talk more of, and if there's specific questions, do note them down and we can talk about it. If we go to the next slide, I just thought it's really important that we are really aware of fluctuations and what are the things that influence our senses, because it really depends on the day, the time of day. It also impacts, is influenced by what we're doing. So what demands are being made of us, how stressed we're feeling, and also who we're with. Are we with people that we like? Are we with people that we don't like? And all of these things, and this is where I was saying, we are, as human beings, we are connected with our environment. We are connected with things that we do. We can have different responses. For some of us, today will be a good day. Tomorrow, don't look at me, don't talk to me, because my cup will be kind of overflowing. And what I'll just kind of say, there's a little note in terms of our auditory responses. They don't necessarily change from day to day, but they can be more or less. So if you are sensory sensitive, in other words, too much noise or certain sounds can be really awful and you just cannot cope with it. Usually that stays the same, but the intensity can vary. Some days you can cope with a little bit more, other days you just cannot tolerate it. Just the thought of a certain sound can kind of send you in overdrive. So just be aware of that. And that's where the complications, it really gets complicated. And I think as a parent, you're just thinking, oh my goodness, it's such a maze. And I really appreciate that. I think when we're talking about sensory integration, there's no easy solution, especially when on a day-to-day basis within the home setting. Before we move on to kind of questions, this is my talking to you about sensory integration, sensory processing. We're coming to the end of the nitty-gritty of what it is. On the next few slides, I just wanted us to kind of be aware of the current thinking and what we hear from local authorities, from schools, from therapists. What's the difference between sensory integration and sensory strategies? What is the difference? Because I think it's really important. There is a difference, and we need to sometimes just know what is what. So this is this bit of the talk. I'm going to just leave this here, and I'll definitely take as many questions as we can about sensory regulation, or what it is when we are feeling dysregulated and what we can do about it. In the handout, I'll just say that here at this point, in the handout, I have included a few ideas, but I have to just say that it is very generic and it is just some ideas. I'll do my best in question times to be very specific, but it is a very individual to address sensory difficulties. It's very individual. It's individual to a child. It's individual to their setting, and it's also can be very individual to what we're expecting them to do. Right. So on the next slide, I've put the RCOT. So that's our Royal College of Occupational Therapy. I just thought it would be important. Because I'm not sure, how much you've been part of these discussions, but especially, I think it was about 5 years ago, there was a big discussion about sensory integration, and the Royal College of OT basically said sensory integration doesn't work, it's ineffective, and it shouldn't be used. And since then, and over the last, I'd say the last 10, 15 years, in terms of sensory integration, a lot of research has happened. And I am going to go into that a little bit, just kind of on the surface. Because sensory integration, it's not something you can see. You know, it is, it's quite theoretical in some ways, because we're working with the brain, and unless we've got every child on a kind of MRI, a walking mobile MRI, we won't see the brain changes that happens. And it is quite lengthy. You know, it's not a quick fix. And because what we are trying to do is we are trying to kind of change the way that the brain registers, processes, and responds to sensory information. So it's not a quick fix. So rightly so, you know, the Royal College of OT just said, we don't believe in this. This is not going to happen. This is not going to be okay. And they put it out in the public, but they didn't really consult. And they based it not on the most current information. So there was a big backlash and lots of kind of stuff in the OT world. Everybody was up in arms, and they have revised it. And I just think it's really important that we know what they are saying, what the Royal College of OT is saying, because local authorities, schools, and for some of you that may need to appeal against an EHCP process, I think it's really important that you know what is it that the Royal College is saying at this moment, and with a much more informed view. What they are saying is that occupational therapists should maintain their occupational focus, and I'll explain that in a minute. Sensory issues must be considered in the context of the person's occupational engagement and performance within relevant environments. So what this means is, as an occupational therapist, my focus is on function. So when I work with a child, I'm looking at all the functional areas, the everyday things, self-care, play, interactions with other kids, school, the academic side of school. What is it in school that stops them from learning? What is it, you know, at home that makes self-care difficult? What is it that makes, you know, tying their shoelaces? Or what is it that makes that difficult? And the way, so we start at the end, we start with that occupations, and we start, and then we look at the environment, as I said, and then we break it down, and we then go to the body, and we say, okay, from a sensory perspective, from a motor perspective, from a motivation perspective, from a cognitive perspective, what is it? What are the barriers? And how can we address that? So that's what an occupational therapist do, really. And that's all that Royal College is saying. You know, they are saying, if you're going to use sensory integration or sensory-based interventions, it's really important to have that functional outcome. It's no good to just have a kid on a swing and say that's sensory integration and we're working on their sensory integration. What is that going to achieve? Why are they on the swing? Okay, they're on a swing because we want to make them less gravitationally insecure. We want them to be able to walk on the beam in a PE lesson. We want them to be able to cope with a car journey. And that's why we're putting them on a swing. So that's what I just wanted to make clear. And what they've also recognized is that where sensory integration is used, and I'm going to talk a little bit now about the differences, the occupational therapist should be adequately trained and experienced in using this approach. And that goes for anything. You know, I always say, I won't go to an orthopedic surgeon if I wanted to have brain surgery, you know. So you need to make sure, and that's just something that I want to kind of just highlight to you as well, is that if you are seeking, if your child presents with sensory integration difficulties very specifically, then it is really important that the therapist working with your child is adequately trained. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So I just put that out there. So this is something that's current, and it's kind of keeps coming up. One of the things that I do is I do work with a lot of parents, and I support them in the tribunal process. And I can't tell you how many times we have to have this discussion in a tribunal setting, why sensory integration is necessary for a child. But that is the current view of the Royal College of OT. So let's look a little bit now on the next slide. And I promise you we are really nearly the end. I know I've noticed it's 8:03. Sensory integration, what is it? And what is sensory approaches or sensory strategies? So at a very basic level, sensory integration is something that Jean Ayres started to investigate and explore in the 70s. And we have now coined it as Ayres sensory integration. So it's a very specific approach, and it's now got a copyright to it. If you're going to use sensory integration, you need to have postgraduate training in sensory integration. So in the UK, we've got two bodies. We've got SI Network and ASI-WISE. SI Network asks that you have complete three modules. ASI-WISE have 6 shorter modules that they ask that you need to be trained to the level that you can, with confidence and with experience and with knowledge, can use sensory integration as an approach, because it is neurologically based. And I think that's what people miss. There's a lot of neurology, and you learn a lot about the brain, and you learn a lot about how the body responds. So it's not just a very quick, 2-day course. To be trained in sensory integration is a process. It takes usually about 18 months to do, and at the moment both courses actually offers a master's option. Ayres sensory integration, traditionally, I've just put a little small picture there. Traditionally, it's in a clinic where we can use different equipment, where we can very specifically target, especially the tactile, the proprioceptive, and the vestibular sense. We can provide just right challenges. What I mean by that is we start with where the child is, and we challenge the child just enough to kind of build on it the next time. And as I said, you're in it for the long haul. You're looking at, there's different approaches to this. In the United States, they tend to take a very intensive approach, where they will say you have to attend 2 to 3 sessions a week. And you have to do that for about 10 to 12 weeks, so about 30 sessions. So if we think about dosage, in the UK, we tend to often look at a more combined approach, where we look at once a week sessions, and then supplemented with other sensory approaches. So a sensory approach, on the other hand, usually it's occupational therapists who will oversee sensory approaches, but you don't have to be an occupational therapist. We usually train the teaching staff in how to use some of the sensory strategies. And there are a whole host of sensory strategies that we can use. I've just listed a few here. So sensory fiddle toys, weighted blankets, sensory circuits that a lot of schools will have in place. A sensory diet, if you hear that, that's a sensory approach that we use. So you don't need any specialist training for it. Anybody can really do it. With a day's training, some people offer a day training. There are lots of courses available to do this, but that's a sensory approach. And the big difference for me, if we go to the next slide, the difference between the two is with Ayres sensory integration, it's the child initiates it. So your whole therapy, so as an occupational therapist trained in SI, I will have all my knowledge, so I've got all my tools, but I look at where the child is and I work from there. So everything is child initiated, because we believe in SI that it's only when a child is internally motivated and when it's a play-based approach, that's when change happens, neurological change happens. So that's the 2 ingredients that we need for neurological change. So in other words, brain change to start to happen. So there is a fidelity measure. What I mean by that is there's certain criteria now for occupational therapists trained in SI, where you can judge a session and you can say, right, it meets all of these criteria. Yes, it's SI. And if it doesn't meet all those criteria, it's not. You cannot call it an SI session. So there's lots you can if you Google SI fidelity measure, it's open in the public, and you can have a look at what it is. What I will also say about SI, there's often an argument that it's not effective. It's absolutely evidence-based. There's a very, very strong evidence base for autism, and that's probably the area that's been most researched in. But we know for children who experience adverse experiences, who have trauma, ADHD, language disorders, there's a definite overlap with the sensory integration system, and that research is coming. There's constant research being done about it. SI is dynamic, it's changing the neurological processing. That's the underlying aim, but we're looking at function as well. Sensory strategies, there's actually very little research of the effectiveness. There's some research out there on weighted blankets, but actually when you look at sensory circuits, there's not a lot of research. But what I mean, but I'm not saying it's not efficient, and I'm not saying it's not effective. It does have an effect, but it's very, I think what we need to keep in mind is that it needs to be effective for the child. So it needs to be very individualized. The difference is it's adult initiated, or it's initiated outside of the child. It's being done to the child. The child participates in a sensory circuit that's set up for them. The child has a weighted blanket that they put on their lap. So it's not something that the child does. It doesn't come from that internal motivation. Yes, some children will ask for a weighted lap, or a weighted blanket, and that's true. But it's something static that is being done to the child, if I put it that way. And it is very much regulation focused. So we don't really look at the discrimination side of things. So it's trying to kind of keep a child calm and alert. So that is all the information that I have tonight. So thank you very, very much for listening to me. I hope I haven't kind of just been too quick.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, let's have a look at some questions here. Somebody saying thank you. Can you recommend a parent-friendly book to read with further information?
Yes, I can. There's several books out there. There's the sensory. What's it just gone out of my mind now? Kranovich is an author. If you just Google her, any of her books are amazing. That's probably going to be the easiest way to say. So Kranovich, I'll try and kind of put that. I can send you all the names for this, but she's a nursery teacher, and but she's amazing. And she writes a very practical book explaining regulation, very much regulation based. And then she has activities. She has books with the most wonderful